What's going on, everybody? Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and whatever time it is. Welcome back to another video with me, Measureaholic. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another campaign slash faction overview for the Divide et Impera overhaul mod for Total War Rome 2. This time we are looking at the Iceni. That's right, today we are going to Britain and looking at one of the most notorious tribes that has ever lived in Britain itself, the Iceni. This could be a really interesting look into this faction. It was personally requested by a few of you guys in the comments, so thank you very much for that. Please do keep those comments coming. I am taking them into heavy consideration. We have a lot of factions to get through for DEI, and that's just in the grand campaign. I might even look into doing other campaigns as time goes on, so please keep your suggestions coming. I am planning to look into Parthia very soon. I know that was requested a couple times, and I'm also very curious to see what happens when I take a bit of a closer look at them. But anyway, getting into the Iceni. Now first, like many of the other Britannia style factions, they have two perks that they share with them. Firstly, they have their Fierce Independence, which gives them plus 10% melee defense for all of their units when they are in their own or allied territory. Nothing crazy, but definitely not bad at all. Just a decent perk and something to be aware of when you are fighting superior enemies, aka the Romans or somebody else. If you can have a choice to fight a battle on enemy territory or your own, you might just want to try to slightly favor fighting in your own territory when you can. But it's not a big deal. 10% isn't going to make or break a battle for you. However, you also have the Heroic Ethos, which increases your charge for all of your units. Depending on how much it increases, it could be very good, but in my opinion it's probably similar to around the 10% mark for the bonus. Either way, increased charge is always welcome, and especially since a lot of your tactics are going to be based around ambushing enemy armies, or at least enemy armies of superior quality, such as the Romans and the Hellenic factions, and possibly even some of the Gallic factions to your south. But getting down to the specific bonuses for the Iceni, they have the Children of Andraste perk, which gives them increased morale and experience for chariots. Hint hint, you're going to be using chariots when you're playing as the Iceni. However you're going to use them, that's up to you. I will talk about chariots a lot more once we get to the military stage. I've talked a lot of crap about chariots in recent videos, and I'll elaborate a little bit on that when we do get to the military, so stick around for that. It's going to be a very interesting little discussion. I'm interested to see what you all think about chariots as well. Second perk is Pastoral Ways. They have increased agricultural income. Not bad, not great. It's just going to give you a little bit of boost to all of your agricultural buildings, which is one of the main things you'll be using for your income, although trade is certainly a possibility depending how you play. If you want to take Britain and turtle up for a while, feel free to get as much trade as you like, and you will have the opportunity to. So you're not necessarily going to have to rely on agriculture. It depends on how you play, really. But the Iceni are not really a quote-unquote civilized faction, so they might not have the I guess the bonuses that someone like Carthage would. Carthage is obviously a lot more specialized for trade, and they were well known for it, so take that as you will. However, they do have the Insular negative perk, which gives a public order penalty from foreign cultures. You're a fiercely warlike and independent people. Not only do you want to be independent of others, but you don't want to mingle with others. So you're going to be having to deal with that as you start expanding out of Britain and encountering cultures that do not share with your own. Keep in mind, the Iceni are a Britannic culture, or Britannic, I believe is what it's called in the game. They are not a Celtish culture. Now, in real life, I'm not going to get into what the culture should or should not be portrayed as, but I'm just telling you straight up, in the game, the majority of cultures in Britain are under the Britannic trait. Whereas there's Celts, Belgians, all of these other cultures across the English Channel to your southeast. So do keep that in mind. You are not under the same culture as them. As soon as you start getting out of Britain, you will notice more public order issues that you have to deal with, so do keep that in mind. However, that's pretty much it. Now, let's jump on into the campaign map and see how the Iceni starting position is. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with our strategic campaign overview for the Iceni, Part 1. This is going to be fairly quick and easy. As you can see, the Iceni are a one settlement faction at the start of the game. You do have the capital of the province of Britannia, so that is good. You have a walled settlement, although it is going to be a barbarian settlement, which means it's not going to be as formidable as, say, somewhere like Syracuse or Rome. So don't be too reliant on your walls, but you can also be a little bit more lazy in terms of the amount of garrison troops you keep in the city. You will be fairly safe sending your army out to conquer your neighbors, while you have a fairly small garrison to keep an eye on things here. Furthermore, you basically have a tiny starting position, but so does all of your neighbors. There's almost nobody near you that has more than one settlement to their name. So that makes it very easy for you to do some conquering. However, you might not want to rush into it. If we go to the diplomacy here real quickly, you actually know a lot of the people around you already, so that's quite helpful. And as we scroll up and down through here for the diplomacy, you'll see the majority of people are neutral to you. You do have one faction here, the Atrebates, that are hostile towards you. I wouldn't worry too much about that. They are your closest Gallic neighbor, but I mean, are they going to come across the water and hunt you down? It's unlikely. It's possible if they have no enemies down here, but the majority of the time the Gauls fight amongst themselves anyway, so I wouldn't worry too much about them, but do keep an eye on it. They might end up sending a fleet against you. But what I wanted to get to saying though is that a lot of your neighbors are actually quite friendly when you start off. For example, these two neighbors here, you could actually get trade and non-aggression pacts with almost immediately. You might need to throw a little money their way, but that's okay. You have a lot of money to spare at the start of the game, and you don't have a lot of things to spend it on, to be honest. Over here in Wales is also a nation that is actually fairly friendly towards you as well. So if you like, you could get friendship with your surrounding Britannic neighbors and turtle up for quite a while. Maybe focus on just going through them, getting military access, taking over the rest of the British Isles, and then coming back and dealing with them. Who knows? It's up to you. But despite being a one settlement faction, you're not necessarily in immediate massive danger. But again, it all depends on the difficulty you play on. Keep that in mind. Everything I say changes with the difficulty. As soon as you put it to hard or very hard, legendary, diplomacy flies out the window, especially for the one settlement factions. A lot of people will be very hostile towards you if you only have one settlement. Especially if your army isn't near that settlement. They'll probably come in and sucker punch you. Keeping in mind as well, you also have Gallic factions to your south here. He will also be fairly friendly towards you. Obviously the Atrebates won't be. The Nervii won't be, nor will the Frisians, as far as I remember. But the majority of your neighbors can be friendly if you want to. You don't immediately have to go into total war mode. But again, that's up to you how you want to play. That's the beauty of Total War games, right? You get to choose how you play. Anyway, my final point for the strategical overview is that your economy is fairly poor, but not massively poor. You do only have a 2100 income at the start of the game, and this is taking into account you're in winter, so once you get out of winter, it is going to increase probably by up to about 1,000. But it isn't all that bad because your units don't cost that much. For example, your general's bodyguard unit is only 270. That's fairly expensive, but that's about as expensive as it's gonna get. Even these hidden spear units, 100. These basic, very levy style spear units is 64. This unit here is actually quite expensive since it is a slinger slash a spearman unit, so it is a dual combo, but it's at 215. That's quite affordable still. You could still have 2, 3, maybe even 4 of those in a couple of your armies, so that's actually not all that bad. And then, like I said, you'll have other AOR units at your disposal. So despite your fairly poor economy at the start, you're not necessarily going to suffer when you build up an army. You will to an extent, but it won't be as dramatic as, say, playing as the Kate, whose units are not very low in their upkeep. Well, some of them are, but the majority are not, especially ones that you'll need for that campaign. But for this one, since you're going to be fighting mainly other Britannic factions initially, you should be okay. And once you take over Britain, or at least take the territory you want, since your capital is right here, you're going to be in a very ideal location to get some trade flowing throughout the other Germanic and Celtic and Gallic and all that kingdoms nearby. You can even send out a fleet to go and discover all of these nations up along the oceans. I would be careful how much you do it. You can get to the point where it's being a little cheesy. For example, sending a fleet all the way down here to Corsica or Italy or something. I feel like that would be kind of gaming the system a little. It's up to you. You play how you like. But in the mid to late game, trade is certainly going to be a possibility for you. But early on, you're going to have a small economy. But as long as you play it relatively smart, it won't impact you massively when it comes to your armies. And now here's my last point. I know I said I only have one more, but this I swear is my last point for the campaign. You only have one city, and so that means you only have one income of population. Be very careful with this. Any faction at all that only has one city is very at risk of losing its population very quickly and just losing the ability to field armies whatsoever. You are fairly lucky in that a good chunk of your units come from the bottom tier population. Or is it the bottom or the second bottom? Let me just double check that for you. It's the second bottom, the Synclethi, however you want to pronounce that. So initially you'll be able to field a lot of very cheap units, which will be very helpful for you. You'll be able to use these to either hold the line or just swarm enemy units, however you want to use them. But do keep in mind that for any faction that only has one settlement at the start of the campaign, you're going to be at risk of you losing the ability to field armies if you're reckless with your armies. If you create, say, 2 or 3 armies full of levies, go and attack the Rate here, you'll win. But if you're too reckless and you let them die to a slinger or archer fire or whatever, you've just lost half of your population. And then that will affect your income, your happiness, and then it trickles out and can spiral out of control if you're not careful. So don't let population in Divide and Impera be ignored, especially in the latest patch, which is the 1.2.6 build that I'm reviewing this faction in. Be very careful. Population can come back to bite you in the butt. Trust me, I know. I've done a lot of migration style campaigns where population was a massive issue and it wrecked me. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much it for the campaign overview part of this section. Fairly simple, fairly straightforward. Now let's get on to the military. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to part 2 of the video where we look at and examine the military side of things for the faction, in this case the Iceni. We're going to be starting off with the Navy, and then we'll jump into a battle where you can see their military land forces. As you can see, their Navy is almost non-existent. It is really, really bad. Even the general unit that they get only has a ship health of 968. That's very, very basic, and it's your only option. You do get that same unit as a recruitable melee ship, but it is quite expensive, and I just don't see it being worth it, really. For 70% basically of the price, you can get a ship that only has 168 less health, and it will have only about 25 less troops, so you may as well just get this ship instead. It's just not worth it, in my opinion. Their navy sucks. Don't rely on it to defend your borders, or if you do, you really gotta know what you're doing. I really wouldn't bother with slingers on a boat. They're just not gonna be worth it. You may as well just get some melee ships. If you absolutely have to rely on this to defend your shores, then focus on trying to board the enemy as quickly as you can, and board them with multiple ships at a time if possible. But for the most part, despite being a British quote-unquote faction, your navy sucks. Hopefully mercenaries can help you out, but in my opinion the best defense to holding your coastal settlements is having small garrisons in place, or you have allies that have navies. Force people to be your client state that are coastal settlements, and then hopefully that will help you defend against naval invasions. But besides that, for naval defenses, rely on your land troops, in my opinion. I mean, if you can do good with a navy, good luck, have fun. But I'm not going to bother in my campaigns as the Iceni. I'm just going to chill and rely on my small garrisons to defend my coastal settlements, rely on archers and spears to hold the line. But anyway, let's jump into a battle and check out the land troops for the Iceni. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are looking at the military of the Iceni, the part 2 of the part 2. We've already had a quick look at their navy, which is pretty terrible, but now we're going to look at the army of the Iceni, starting off here with the general's bodyguard unit. This is one unit out of 3 possibilities that you can have as your general. The other one is a Britannic noble unit that I'll show you shortly, and then there's also a cavalry unit that you can use. I generally recommend using the cav unit. However, this unit here, this I guess you would say it's a second tier swordsman unit for your general. This is actually the best armored unit you get in your entire roster, with an armor of 38. So it actually is not a bad idea to use this sword unit in your early to mid campaigns against lightly armored enemies, especially against your Britannic neighbors. I would recommend you use this swordsman unit when you feel it's appropriate, not necessarily all the time. General cavalry units are very helpful and allow your general to get around the battlefield, so don't underestimate cavalry. But this is the best army you get, which is very pathetic. But anyway, as always, the unit is looking fantastic. One thing that we're going to notice while looking at this roster though is that there's almost no armor penetration. If we have a look here though, our weapon damage is at 30, an attack of 15. This is a very aggressive unit, but the armor pen is only at 2. So these guys are going to be slaughtering lightly armed troops, but once they start encountering heavily armored troops, such as some of the heavily armored spearmen in Gaul, or the, of course, legionnaires of Rome, that's where they're going to really struggle in head-on collisions. But if they get a rear charge or something like that, they're actually going to do fairly well, although their charge bonus is just at 21, which is pretty average. Probably quite low considering this is the best, one of the best sword units arguably for the Iceni. But armor isn't everything, and we'll see why I said it's one of the best swordsman units shortly, not the best. But anyway, that's our general's bodyguard unit. I'm going to try and get through this section as quickly as possible. I've already recorded this a couple times, and each time I go well over an hour, despite them only having a small roster. So for the swordsman here, I'm going to try and clump things up a little bit and give you guys mainly the highlights. Here are some of the swordsmen that you can recruit. They are your very basic general hold the line type of swordsman. Their attack is quite decent. Melee defense is okay at 10, pretty average. Charge bonus 19, average / below average. Weapon damage at 28 though, which is quite good. But again, no armor penetration. Their armor is only 15. So these guys will hold the line for you with a morale of 43. But if they get outflanked and your better units start getting demolished, they're going to rout and not necessarily hold for as long as you would want. Again, very good looking unit. These are all fantastic looking units. I need to stop repeating that, but I also want to give as much praise as possible to the modders for their hard work. I mean, look at this detail on this shield. Isn't that just fantastic? Wow. Of course, we have the blue paint, famous of the Iceni and some of the other Britannic tribes. Very, very cool. But yeah, this is a fairly lightly armored swordsman unit, but it's going to be your general hold the line swordsman unit, or at least one of them. They also have a lot of troops in their unit, usually 300, but because I only have unit sizes on large, it's at 225. So keep that in mind. This will be making up the primary battle line of your army in most cases. But here is arguably one of your best swordsman units, if not the best swordsman unit. I would argue it is the best. And why is that? Not only because they have massive two-handed swords that look fantastic, but they have a melee attack of 15. And that's just starting off at the base. As your units get more experience and you get upgrades for them, it's going to be even higher than that. Melee defense is abysmal at 4. This is terrible. for a swordsman unit. However, they have a charge bonus of 34. That's more than some cavalry units. These guys are very good on the charge, and they are very strong. Their weapon damage is 25, which is still quite good. I would even call that great. It's not fantastic, but I would say it's great. These guys are going to be your killers. They are going to be slaughtering the enemy heavily armed troops, especially when they get a rear charge on them. If they get a frontal charge, they'll still do damage, but after that initial charge, they're going to start dropping like flies. So the only time I would keep them in a extended combat is when they're charging an enemy from behind. But these are going to be some of your most valuable troops on the battlefield. They're going to be killing legionnaires. They're going to be killing the veteran legionnaires of the Roman legions that you'll have to deal with. They'll be slaughtering hoplite units. They'll be cutting down the heavy armored spear units of the Gauls. Even some of the barbarian hoplites. These guys will be your killers. That's what they are. They're not necessarily soldiers, but they're killers, if that makes sense. Think of it that way. They're going to be doing a lot of your killing. Very lightly armored unit here, as are most of your swordsmen. All of your units, really. Not a lot to say about this besides that they are good at hiding, and they have a large size of usually 300, but again, playing on a large unit size instead of on ultra. Not much more else to say about these guys other than they have guerrilla deployment. And they have campaign stealth, which, I mean, it's as useful as I guess you could debate it being useful. I don't really care about campaign stealth. I don't think it really helps all that much unless you're in a multiplayer campaign, and even if you are, if you're going up against somebody, they're going to figure out pretty quickly what units you have that are hidden from them anyway, so it's not all that useful, but this is a decent swordsman unit for using in ambushes. But yeah, don't expect them to do all that much killing or hold the line. They will attack the enemy from the rear, and they will do it okay, but not as well as some of your other units, such as this unit right here. This is not necessarily a berserker unit, but it is one of your more aggressive units that are going to die very quickly. Melee defense of 11, which is fairly average, but their armor is only 8, man. I mean, their armor is so abysmal. They don't even have clothing on, most of them. So they do have some weapon damage. Weapon damage is 28, but despite them wielding axes, their armor penetration is only at 2. So it's kind of a little bit misleading. Generally, axes are very good at armor pen, but these units are not. So be aware of that. They're going to die quickly, and they're not going to kill heavily armored units quickly. But with a melee attack of 13 as its base, that's still quite good, and they are going to kill lightly armored units. So these will also be good at flanking the enemy and getting kills on other Britannic factions and the Gauls, and just generally lightly armored factions they will do well against if they don't get hammered by skirmisher fire. And then moving on as quickly as we can, here we have Britannic Druids. Now this is a very, very valuable unity. Not only are they very aggressive, melee attack 15, charge bonus 21, which is still quite good, weapon damage of 30, which is very, very high. Again, no armor penetration. Armor 28 though. So these guys are actually going to be able to charge into the front of enemy units, and they're not going to die instantly. They have a melee defense of 12 as well. So these are going to be very useful units to you. You're not going to be making your battle lines out of them though. They're too hard to get to make an entire army out of, at least in the early to mid game. Late game you can do whatever you want, as you can for almost any faction. But they also inspire nearby units. And they are impetuous as well, which basically they get extra morale. So this is one of your morale boosting units. Try not to let them get separated from your main army. Keep them nearby your pleb troops like these units here, and that will help them stay on the battlefield. Okay, and coming up to our last swordsman unit here, we have the Britannic Nobles. This is your low tier general's bodyguard unit. I say low tier because they just generally have lower stats. They do have a decent attack of 15, defense of 12, charge bonus 21, weapon damage 30, so they have all the makings of what could be a decent unit. But this is a general's bodyguard, and they have an armor of only 25. They have almost no armor penetration. Speed is okay. I mean, they would be a decent sword unit if they weren't protecting your king or your general, which is generally going to be your king. Especially in the early game. I would almost never recommend you get this sword unit if you can instead get the other bodyguard unit that I listed to you earlier. It's just better. There's almost no reason to get this unless you have to wait for certain buildings or something, but I don't believe you do. So I would just recommend you get the other unit once it's available to you. Don't really look back at this, you're not missing much. You can get it to support your troops on the battlefield, but I would rather spend your money on getting this druidic unit here, which has very similar statistics and in fact is better in every single way. They have the same stats in melee fighting, but the druids have better armor and better morale by quite a bit. They are slightly slower with a speed of 2 instead of 3, but speed isn't going to win you a battle. It's going to be lasting long and killing the enemy. So yeah, I wouldn't even bother getting these units, just get the druids if you can. Yeah, no points in them. But anyway, moving on, speaking of no point, we are now at our spearmen, and oh man, the Iceni roster starts to get very rough now. These are your highest tier spears that you get, which is a light spear infantry unit. They do have a unit size of 300 if you're playing on Ultra. Again, looking fantastic as always. A lot of variety in the faces and the armor and the clothing. Whew, very, very impressive. They have a decent defense of 19, but not all that great. It's still pretty decent. They will survive for quite a while. Armor of 15 though, so don't let these outfits fool you. Their armor is only at 15, which is very low. Base morale of 43. Weapon damage of 24, which is okay. They do have a very good bonus against cavalry though at 11. That's quite good considering that these guys are going to be pretty cheap and easy to get. So these guys will be helping your cavalry defeat the enemy's cavalry, and that's about it. Do they even have... No, they don't even have a shield wall ability. So you're not even going to want to use these guys as your main battle line while your swordsmen hit the flanks of the enemy. These are cav killers. That's pretty much it. Don't use them for anything else. Unless you're desperate and you have to. Speaking of which though...
Levy Freeman!
As that guy was just yelling. This is what these units pretty much are. They do have a good charge defense, however, they don't even have guerrilla deployment. Melee attack of 6, defense of 14, charge bonus 16, weapon damage 20. Basically worse than this other spear unit in every single way. The only reason you're going to get this is because you can't get that other spearman unit. Again, use this spear unit purely just for supporting your cavalry or stopping the enemy's cav from getting to specific units you want to protect, like your archers or your morale boosting troops. Very, very low tier unit. They're not going to get a lot of kills. Even if they fight cavalry, they're still going to need some time to get the kills on the cav since they have fairly low melee attack. So yeah, just try not to use them if you can. Rely on these other spears when you can get them, which hopefully you can fairly soon. Moving on though, that's it for the spears. We only have the 2 units. Now we're going to our skirmisher department, and it's not looking all that much better. We have a bit of a unique unit here though, in that we have slingers, but if you look closely you'll notice that they have spears. This unit of slingers actually is a bit of a duo unit in that they have spears. They have some decent defense of 10. I say it's decent, generally it isn't, but this is a slinger unit, keep in mind. It's not a spear unit. So it's okay, but they don't have expert charge defense. And it doesn't even look like they have a bonus against cavalry. Yeah, I'm not seeing it listed here, so unless it's an unlisted stat, which is possible. I mean, it's just a pretty pathetic unit, and it's going to cost you a bit more upkeep and just more to recruit than a basic slinger would. They do have decent range at 215 though, and their missile damage is at 13, so yeah, it could be argued that they're worth getting based solely just off that, to be honest. But yeah, they're not going to change the battle all that much for you. They'll just give you a little bit of extra range over the enemy slingers, if their slingers are very poor quality, which they probably will be for the most part, especially going up against the other Britannic tribes. But that's basically the only thing worth mentioning in the skirmishing department. Incredibly basic slingers here, missile damage of 11. There's just nothing else worth talking about here. Very basic slinger unit. And then skirmishers. Notice you don't even have an archer unit listed. You'll be relying on AOR units or mercenaries to fill the archer department up for you. But yeah, again, nothing really worth saying. They're just a very basic, very generic skirmisher unit. Use them when you know you're going up against enemy cav or heavy units that you're going to struggle against. But yeah, there's just not, let's say, ammunition of only 8. So they're not even going to be doing all that much throughout the battlefield. Just these are a little bit more used for sniping, like a enemy general, or like I said, a heavily armored swordsman unit. I almost wouldn't even bother getting these skirmishers, to be honest. I'd rather rely on your cavalry and having mobile armies, which is where we're getting to now. Now we are on the cavalry side of things.
Proud sons
These
of Britain!
are basically the Iceni's version of Roman equites. Very standard kind of cav. Stats aren't really all that great, but they're also not all that bad. I have an armor of 23 despite looking like they're only wearing their loincloths. Although I suspect a lot of that armor comes from their shield. However, yeah, see here it says base value of 23 in the bottom left corner when I hover over this. Shield value is 0. You can't really trust these statistics because it doesn't really list it appropriately, because they have these massive shields, but they have no armor on, so I wouldn't really trust that armor 23, to be honest. Even though they have the large shields, they're still going to be susceptible to slingers and skirmishers because of them having the large hitbox since they're on a horse. Yeah, I don't know, it's a basically Iceni equite unit. They're going to do okay against enemy cavalry. They can charge into the rear of enemy units. They have a decent charge bonus of 45, but yeah, you can't really rely on them as solid shock cavalry, and you shouldn't because you have chariots, which we'll get to shortly. But yeah, these are going to be very generic cav that you'll have in most of your armies to use in versatile ways. Oh, and as a side thing, even though it looks like they have javelins right here, do not be fooled, they actually do not have any on the battlefield. You can see here on their unit card they don't even have ammunition listed, so perhaps that's a unknown issue or a known issue, but they shouldn't have these small little javelins here because they don't throw them, at least not on the battlefield. So perhaps they're just there as a visual thing to look like they're a spare spear. If that spear gets broken, perhaps, I don't know. But yeah, they don't actually throw any javelins. Moving on now, this is one of your shock units, well, your only shock unit really. This is quite a good cavalry unit. Melee attack of 13, defensive 14, barely above average. Charge bonus of 37 though. Weapon damage of 32. And they have a bonus versus infantry, which is quite interesting. And no bonus against cavalry, which is funny because I would consider these cavalry, which is basically your noble horse cav, I would consider them cavalry killers. They're going to be doing better in extended melees against enemy cav units. Armor 28, base morale of 49, so they're quite good. And they have... How is the speed of this other unit healers? So this unit has a speed of 7.
Heroic
and these guys have a
riders!
speed of 6. So yeah, they're going to do well in extended combat against most enemy cavalry. They still will need some support, especially against better trained and better armored cavalry, which you'll encounter as you get onto the continent and out of Britain. But yeah, they are quite elite, so they're not going to be easy to get. They're going to be fairly expensive to keep and maintain. You'll probably have 1, maybe 2 per army if you try. But yeah, use them to deal with the enemy's cav and crush their support. Once you do that, use their decent charge bonus and bonus versus infantry to start doing some rear charges. Pretty versatile unit, but they are expensive, so do be careful with them. Don't throw them away. Alright, moving on to the skirmisher cav.
Horsemen!
Very basic cavalry unit, unfortunately. They do have the Parthian shot ability, which allows them to fire javelins in all directions. However, I think the majority of skirmisher cav have that ability. I need to double check that, and I'll talk about that in a future video. And they can fire whilst moving, which all skirmisher cav can. But firing in any direction, I'm not sure what skirmisher cav can and cannot do that. So I'll need to look into that a little bit further. But anyway, focusing on this unit right here in this video. It's just a very generic cavalry unit, skirmisher cav unit. It's very low armor. You're going to die to enemy archers and skirmishers in general very easily. Just try to use them to deal with enemy lightly armored troops, like maybe use them to chase down enemy archers, or to try and use their javelins to target enemy units. However, again, they only have an ammunition of 8, which is pretty standard, but considering this is your only mounted skirmishing unit, that's not great. So yeah, they're not going to be doing skirmishing throughout the entire battle. They just don't have the armor or the attack or defense really to back them up and make them versatile. They do have a charge bonus of 44 though, which is actually quite impressive, but it's probably because they have a speed of 8. So they are very fast horses. Very, very fast. So use their speed as much as you can. Try and charge the enemy down in the rear or against the skirmishers. Anyway, moving on to the last couple units here, which is of course the Iceni special, the chariots. Here we have the noble chariots here on the left. I'll move them over just a little bit more. Then on the right, we have just what they call Britannic chariots right here. You can see. Which are basically the lower tier chariots. Which is funny because there's more of them available here. You can see I have 45 chariots there, whereas the noble chariots only have 23. However, in my testing that I've done, I've not been very extensive in it. I've done a fair bit though. I would not recommend getting these chariot units almost at all. The only time I would be in like the first probably 30-40 turns of the campaign when you're fighting only Britons, because you'll be going up against lightly armored factions that are very similar to yours in composition, and they might be helpful at chasing down enemy skirmishers, possibly charging in the rear. But even then, I mean, you see, the problem was in the testing that I did with these two chariots. These chariots died to volleys of Roman javelins that were thrown from the Roman legionnaires. So that's not sustained javelin fire coming at them. That's just 3 or so units throwing off their javelins before the chariots can even engage them. So to see such a very fragile unit be quite expensive and be very micromanagement intensive, which in turn basically just makes it not all that cost effective, I would not recommend getting this chariot unit. Not unless you really know your chariots and you really think that you can handle the micromanagement to keep them away from any kind of skirmisher fire at all, including javelins thrown from soldiers such as swordsmen, spearmen, whatever, which a lot of troops have, especially in Divided Impera. So I would not really recommend getting these. Instead, I would say focus on getting the noble horse chariots. They are very expensive though,
ready!
but in my opinion they're quite worth it. They're basically the elephants of the barbarian world. They're definitely nowhere near as effective as elephants. They're not going to get you 700-800 kills per battle like a single elephant unit can, such as Syrian hairy elephants, unless you're insanely good with your skill and you get lucky with your enemy army you're going up against. But they have an armor of 41, which is quite literally the best out of your whole roster if you don't take into account your general unit that we talked about earlier, which has 38 in his armor. Their other statistics are quite good though. Melee attack of 16, melee defense of 18, charge bonus of 38, which is kind of low considering these are your noble chariots. These are the best of the best that you get. They do have an armor penetration of 9 though, base morale 52, and a speed of 7. So despite them being decently armored, especially for your faction, they are still quite fast. But again, even though they have these decent statistics, you don't want them to be in combat for long. You want them to hit the enemy and back off very quickly. These units are specializing in hitting clumps of infantry, especially heavily armored infantry from the rear, from the flanks, although rear is preferred, or running down enemy skirmishers. How they are against cavalry depends entirely on the charge and what cav they're going up against. I wouldn't recommend you use them against enemy cav. That's a good way to hunt chariots down in general, is using cavalry and skirmishers. But yeah, these guys they can really win you a lot of battles, especially in the early game when you're going to be struggling to get a lot of kills on the enemy. They'll wipe out enemy general units if you can place them in the correct position, and doing so will cause most of the enemy armies to rout pretty quickly, since you'll be going up against lowly trained barbarian style factions. But anyway, that's the entire Iceni roster that we've just looked at here. They do have some AOR and mercenary units in the campaign that they will need to rely on to do well in their campaigns, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next part, part 3, the verdict. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, here we are at the part 3 verdict for our Iceni campaign / faction overview for DEI. So this is going to be fairly short. I only have a few points to make, which I basically I've already talked about, but I'm going to just reiterate to summarize for you. Generally speaking, despite the Iceni having a fairly lackluster roster, their early game is actually going to be fairly easy against their Britannic neighbors. A lot of your neighbors will have a very similar, if not identical, roster to you. However, you do need to be careful of the Caledonians to the far north and the Irish faction in Ireland to your west. They, for some reason, actually have a bit of a larger roster than you, even in the sword and spear department. So do be mindful of that. They're not going to have exactly copy-paste rosters, but they will be similar in nature. But just do keep that in mind. You might have some issues with them. But generally speaking, most of your Britannic factions will be pretty easy for you to gobble up, especially since they aren't all united early on. However, if they do unite, you might have some issues. And so since they have a fairly easy starting position, I'm actually going to say that they are actually a good introduction to barbarian factions in general. A lot of the barbarian factions in the Grand Campaign start off in precarious situations where they're actually at very high risk of losing their campaign within the first 20-30 turns. The Iceni are not really like that unless you play them very, very poorly. They're actually going to do quite well against their early neighbors, even their mid-game neighbors, the Gauls, the Belgae, the Germans. They have the capability to do quite well against them if you use your AOR and mercenary units appropriately. Generally speaking though, as the game goes on, you're going to have a much harder time, especially once you start fighting Greeks, Carthaginians, and Romans. Whoever comes out on top in the Mediterranean, which will most likely be Rome, they're going to generally provide you with a difficult opportunity, almost no matter who it is. If it's the Greeks, Carthaginians, it doesn't matter. You're going to struggle against them all pretty much. So do keep that in mind. You can see how well our chariot unit does charging into the enemy unit. They'll actually do okay since the Romans weren't braced. But if I just leave these units here, they're going to start dying off quite quickly. But anyway, we're not here to test out our units. I'm just showing them to you while we do our talking. Moving forward though, despite the difficulties that you'll face in the late campaign, I still think these are quite a good unit to use when it comes down to just learning how barbarian factions work in general, what kind of different styles there are, because the Iceni are different to, say, Gauls to the south, or even the Germans to the east. Even though they're all barbarians, quote-unquote, they will have their own play styles, and the Iceni are very distinct in their own, that they rely on chariots and swordsmen to do a lot of damage to the enemy, and they don't have all that many other options until they start using mercenaries and so on and so forth. Beyond that though, there isn't too much else to say in our verdict. They are a fairly small faction with fairly small issues to deal with, and as long as you're a decent player, most of your campaigns will be quite successful while you're playing as them. It's going to take quite a few mistakes for you to kind of screw up as them. If you're new to DI, I'd even recommend playing as them. Like I said, they're a good starter faction if you're wanting to test out what it's like to play as a barbarian unit. And of course, do keep in mind that your economy is pretty poor at the start, but a lot of your troops do have a fairly low upkeep cost, so you should still be able to field armies. However, you're never really going to have a great economy until you just own massive amounts of land, which is the case for a lot of the factions, or barbarian factions especially. in DEI. You just need a lot of land and a lot of agriculture generally to have a good economy with them. Although I have heard of players focusing on industry and doing quite well, so you might want to investigate that. But moving forward though, do keep in mind your navy is pretty pathetic. Don't rely on it to protect Britain. Rely on your armies being in good positions or basically launching first strikes against enemies that are going to invade against you. Get a beachhead in Gaul before the Romans get a beachhead against you in the late game, etc. But yeah, beyond that, I don't really have too much else to say. Besides the difficulty level, I'm going to give a 5 out of 10. They have an average to easy early game start, but it gets quite harder in the late game campaign as all of your other neighbors, well, most of your neighbors, I should say, and the late game major factions will all severely outclass you. So the longer the campaign goes on, the more you're going to struggle. So good luck with all of that. But by the late game, you should generally have enough territory that you're going to not really worry too much about being outclassed. You should have enough armies to run over Roman legionnaires and so on and so forth. You should be able to field quite a few chariots in your armies in the late game. So late game is always kind of up to you how hard it is, almost no matter what faction it is, because if you make it to the late game, which I would consider 200 plus turns, you should have enough territory and economy to field as many armies as you need to in general, but there are some exceptions. Anyway, 5 out of 10, very average difficulty. Beyond that, ladies and gentlemen, I have nothing else to say about the Iceni. I do recommend playing them if you're new to barbarians, or if you're new to DEI in general. They're a good starting faction to get involved with. But anyway, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I shall see you in the next one.